People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Explore that, what a future legacy might be, and also that expected interest rate rise. What does it mean? Find out after the news.
Good morning, it's just gone 9:30. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. Interest rates are expected to rise from 3.5% to 4% later as the Bank of England makes its 10th increase in a row. It's part of efforts to control inflation and bring it back down to the bank's 2% target. Some experts predict we could see a final hike next month, with interest peaking at 4.5%. Economics commentator Laurie Laird explained how the rise will affect us.
Anyone who has any debt, any credit card debt, a lot of us have credit card debt, and everything is keyed off what's called bank rate. It goes all the way through the system, and it tends to be, we do see consumer interest rates on mortgage rates, credit card debt. We tend to see that go up pretty quickly. We don't tend to see it come down. It's stickier on the way down.
Critics of the Prime Minister say his first 100 days in office have been marred by Tory sleaze scandals and a staggering economy. Rishi Sunak's under pressure to reveal what he knew about bullying allegations against Dominic Raab and Nadhim Zahawi's tax affairs. His time as Prime Minister has also been blighted by continued industrial action and the cost of living crisis. And staying with the cost of living crisis, around 2.3 million households missed an essential payment last month, including mortgages, rent and credit cards, new data reveals. According to Which's Consumer Insight Tracker, 59% of people had to either cut back on essentials, sell property or dip into savings to cover spending. It's calling on essential businesses, including energy providers, to do more to help customers. And Shell says its profits have increased by more than 53%, with earnings of more than £68 billion last year. It's the company's highest profit in its 115-year history. The energy giants benefited from soaring oil prices due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It comes as consumers continue to grapple with soaring energy costs. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to the briefing with Tom Harwood.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:33 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, today marks 100 days of Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. For those keeping up, that's 51 more than Liz Truss. Rishi said he should be judged on, quote, his first 1,000 days rather than his first 100 in office. Well, what could that look like? One MP who has an idea is John Penrose, who yesterday asked the Prime Minister this.
Mr. Speaker, 2 years ago, the Prime Minister commissioned me to propose 30 ways to boost growth and make Britain the most competitive country in the world. So far, we're underway with about half of them. But some of the most valuable, like reforming ponderous and expensive utilities regulators or building on our international lead in open banking, haven't moved at all. So will he meet with me to discuss how to channel our inner Nigel Lawsons and unblock the arteries of our economy with low-cost, pro-competition, supply-side reforms?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend has a long track record in advocating for and implementing policies that increase our competitiveness and reform the supply side of our economy. His report was fantastic and I look forward to meeting with him to discuss them further and help drive growth in this country.
Well, a very interesting point there. The Prime Minister agreeing to meet with John Penrose and look at implementing the rest of those supply-side reforms. Well, what are they? Well, I'm delighted to be joined by John Penrose himself, live from Westminster. And John, first of all, why do you think it is that not all of your recommendations have so far been implemented?
Well, I think it's fairly simple, actually. It was simply that when Rishi commissioned me to do this 2 years ago, he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. He was then Chancellor for about the next year, and we made some decent progress, as you just heard me saying in the chamber yesterday. But then, of course, we had a bit of a sort of a pause last summer, and he wasn't in government, and therefore things sort of lost momentum. So we've got to get back on track. We've got to re-inject that energy that we had.
And what are examples of these things that haven't yet been implemented? That I suppose the big point about these 30 reforms is that they're all sort of politically possible. What's top of the list?
Well, for me at least, the two I mentioned in the chamber in that clip you just played are really, really valuable. One is to reform some of the energy, the utility regulators, just because our utility sector, not just energy but others too, telecoms and water in particular, are moving pretty slowly. They're very heavily burdened by lots and lots of red tape. It means they can't be very customer focused, and the prices that we're all paying as a result are higher than they need to be, even after you've allowed for people like Vladimir Putin invading Ukraine. And the other thing is, there's this bit of our economy called open banking, which is a huge international success. Not many people know about it, but it's an enormous success, and it's kind of an industry of the future. And if we can roll that out to apply across lots of other sectors too, repeat the trick that we've already done in banking, in things like energy, in retailing, in water, elsewhere, then we can have that kind of forward-looking international lead in lots of other industries of the future too.
What do you say to those who say that this has been a government that's been not that enthusiastic about the supply-side reform agenda? The previous Prime Minister listed at least 10 areas of supply-side reform, from planning to childcare to migration to everything else that it was going to get on and do. It seems like not only the tax cuts have been thrown away by this government, but also those big areas of seismic supply-side reform.
You've been here for long?
Well, I was very, very reassured actually by Rishi Sunak's reply to me in Prime Minister's questions yesterday, where he said, yeah, he wants to get on with this, he wants to meet me, he wants to talk about how we can take it forward. And I think, to be fair, in his first 100 days, he's had to do an awful lot of firefighting just to steady the ship, just to settle things down, make sure that the financial markets got back to normal, that interest rates were not spiralling in the wrong direction. And that was priority number one when he took over. Now they've done that, and they've done it very successfully. Now we can get back onto the more longer-term things, which, as you rightly say, are absolutely essential. And I take comfort from the fact that he was the bloke who commissioned me to write this stuff in the first place. So he clearly believes in it, otherwise he wouldn't have asked me to do it in the first place.
Now, of course, at Prime Minister's questions yesterday, he agreed to meet with you to discuss this further. Do you yet have a date in your diary for when that meeting will be?
Not quite yet. I'm afraid these things don't work quite that fast. But we've already reached out, and we're in discussions with the diary folks. So I hope it won't be long.
That is very, very interesting. And just finally, before I let you go, what do you think is going to be the next sort of 100 days of this Prime Minister? How quickly do you think we're going to move from this sort of stabilising era that we seem to be in right now to the real sort of pro-growth era, the sort of reformist era? What are we going to see, and how soon?
Well, I devoutly hope that we're going to move on to that really fast, not just because actually there isn't very much money for other kinds of growth promoting things. You can't do it at the moment through more government spending because there's just no spare cash lying around. So the kinds of reforms which I was asking the Prime Minister about yesterday, which don't cost the taxpayer very much but are really, really valuable and help jobs and growth and all those important things, those really are the sort of the main game, the main opportunity in town at the moment. So I hope he's going to get onto it fast. I mean, he's also said, and I think rightly, that he wants to make sure that he's dealing with his five key priorities which he set in his New Year speech, things like stopping the small boats, trying to reduce NHS waiting times, reducing inflation. All those matter too, but these are a way to get quite a lot of those things done. So I think they kind of all work together.
Well, John Penrose, thank you so much for joining us there live from Westminster, and I hope that the meeting with the Prime Minister, when it does come, goes very well. Now, moving on this morning, later today, the Bank of England is predicted to deliver its 10th interest rate rise in a row, bringing rates to an expected 4%. It's anticipated that this rise will go up from 3.5 to 4%. It would be a 0.5% rise the highest since 2008. Although let's look at the international context here. Yesterday, the United States Federal Reserve raised rates to between 4.5 and 4.75%, far higher than anyone's expecting the United Kingdom to do. Well, let's break it all down now with our economics and business editor, Liam Halligan. Liam, 4%, 4 points. What does it all mean?
Well, this would be the highest interest rate set by the Bank of England in 14 years. In the years before the pandemic, interest rates were well below 1%, and then they went even lower to 1/4% during the COVID lockdown period. We can see that on a graphic here. So there's the interest rates in the run-up to the COVID period, and then during the COVID lockdown, they went to ultra-low levels, and then since then, we've had 9 successive rises by the Bank of England to 3.5%, where they currently are, in a bid to tackle inflation, and inflation is now coming down. That's why, Tom, I don't think interest rates have that much further to go up. I do think we'll see what we call a 50-point rise, 0.5 percentage points, to be pedantic, to 4%. Then I think we'll go up to about 4.25 in the spring. Then I think interest rates will level out and they'll start to come down, actually, before the end of the year. That's my prediction as inflation comes down.
That is really interesting, because there's been a lot of criticism that interest rates were too low for too long, that helped stoke inflation, that's indeed helped stoke malinvestment and other peculiarities in our economy, inflate asset prices and all the rest of it. Should we be really concerned that interest rates are rising, or is this perhaps a normalisation back to the era before the financial crisis?
Well, if you're on a variable rate mortgage, these interest rate rises have been extremely painful. You know, people have lost their homes. And also, if you've got any kind of debt, payday loans or hire purchase agreements on utilities and so on, as GBNews viewers and listeners will tell you, a lot of those rates have gone up. Of course, it's good news if you're a saver. Rates are still way below the rate of inflation, so you're getting what we call negative real returns on your money. But look, a lot of people say to me, a lot of sort of 60-somethings say, oh, back in my day, in the late 80s and early 90s, interest rates were 15%, 20%, and we still managed to work hard and buy our houses. And, you know, today's young people, they eat too many avocado sandwiches, and that's why they can't buy homes.
I have to say, I hate avocado.
Yeah, I know you do, Tom. I know you do. Look, that view is complete nonsense. Why is it nonsense? I'm sticking up for your generation here, Tom. It's complete nonsense because even though interest rates are lower now, house prices are much higher as a percentage of average incomes, right? So mortgage burdens are as high as they were in the late 80s and early 90s, even though interest rates are lower. People are spending, you know, a third on average of their money on their mortgage, their take-home pay, or on their rent, of course, and interest rates could go a little bit higher yet. So I don't buy this idea that just because interest rates are lower than they were in the late 80s and early 90s, when they did get well into double digits, that somehow your generation, Tom, has it much easier, and if only you went to Ibiza less, you'd actually be able to buy a house. I don't buy that at all.
It's interesting because, to some extent, the reason why people are so over-leveraged with their mortgages as things stand, the reason these prices have risen, not just is this lack of building that we've had in the country, but also the low rates that have allowed them to get into this position. So a small rise in rates can have a big impact on a lot of money borrowed.
Because it's proportionately a big rise. You know, if you go up from 3% to 4%, that's a 33% rise in the interest rate. Well, if you go up to, 10% to 12%, it's only a 20% rise in the interest rate. That's true. Look, you're a student of politics. Obviously, the economy is front and centre, even knocking sleaze off the front pages, and rightly so, because this is what people really care about. Yeah. I suggest that in the coming months and towards the end of 2023, inflation will halve, as Rishi Sunak says, not because of anything that he does, but just because the massive price rises of last year will fall out of the numbers, if you like, because they won't be repeated. So suddenly inflation's a lot lower. I do think interest rates will start to come down. I do actually see some green shoots, to use Norman Lamont's phrase back in the day, in the economy. I do think the IMF prediction earlier this week was way out of date, and they over-egged the gloominess. And I think that when this interest rate decision comes at 12 noon today, I will be at the Bank of England reporting on it, analysing it. I think the bank will also release some new forecasts which aren't nearly as gloomy as the forecasts that Governor Andrew Bailey was talking about a month or so ago about the longest recession in British history. I just don't think that's going to happen. I think the Bank of England was too slow to get its head around coming inflation, and I think it's now being too slow to see that there is the speck, at least, of recovery on the horizon.
Well, that is very, very interesting. We'll stick with you all day here on GB News, and especially at midday for that rates decision. Thanks, Liam. Now, moving on, Darren McCaffrey joins us from Downing Street, of course, to reflect on this 100 days in office for Rishi Sunak. Darren, how's he done?
Well, it's really interesting, isn't it, Tom, this 100 days? I mean, there'll be dozens of articles written about it. It's not actually a thing in many regards. It's something we've imported from America that became a thing around the US president's 100 days. I mean, in many regards, Rishi Sunak has done what he set out to achieve fundamentally, which was to stabilise politics and economics in the sense that, remember, he took over at a time in which Liz Truss was Prime Minister, or had just been Prime Minister, which the financial markets were very jittery. There were concerns, and just talking to Liam, about interest rates going way beyond 4%, looking at 5, 6, 7%, and that inflation seemed that there was no end in some regards to inflation. Now, we're in a very different situation today. Liam is right, though, in suggesting that, I mean, the government's really had very little impact on inflation and is not likely to have much impact in the months to come. It is just going to fall because that's how inflation works. But what I would say is there are still lots and lots of testing times ahead for the Prime Minister, Tom, not least of all because we have got scandals still in Downing Street. Dominic Raab was in with the Prime Minister last night. This is the Deputy Prime Minister, the Justice Secretary, who's under an awful lot of pressure about bullying allegations. And there is an investigation taking place. Of course there is. Suggestions, though, from within his own party, a bit like with Nadhim Zahawi, that maybe he should step aside while those investigations are carried out. And the reason this is a problem for Rishi Sunak, twofold. First of all, there are questions about what he knew and when, how and to what extent he knew about these complaints before he appointed him as Deputy Prime Minister. And second of all, Dominic Raab, unlike Nadhim Zahawi, is actually very, very close to Rishi Sunak. He was someone who headed up his leadership campaign last summer. Clearly, he's the Deputy Prime Minister, one of the most senior ministers within government. Then add to that the current disquiet within the Conservative Party has not gone away, in the sense that there are still a lot of Conservatives who believe that taxation is too high, Tom, and it should be cut to try and boost growth. And this is all leading into really difficult opinion polls for Rishi Sunak. We're going to have local elections in May. They could be incredibly difficult for the Conservative Party. Rishi Sunak has not turned around any of those poll deficits the Conservatives have seen. If anything, they are inching in the wrong direction, and for him too. And that means that if we are going to judge things by 100 days, the next 100 days are going to make things potentially, I would suggest, even more difficult for Rishi Sunak, who's already in a very tight corner.
We were, of course, just speaking with Liam Halligan, our economics and business editor, who was talking about the seismic impact of economics here and how so often politics is downstream from economics. It's the economic conditions of things that then lead people to view other issues. In your view, Darren McCaffrey, does the economic situation or the sort of political scandal situation, which of these two will loom largest over Rishi Sunak in the next 100 days?
Well, I think in many regards, what's going to decide the next election, if you want in those terms, coming back to that old Bill Clinton adage, is the economy is stupid, in the sense that Labour are going to pose the question, do you feel better off at that particular time than you did 13, 14 years ago? And for lots of people right now at the moment, the answer to that question is a most definite no. Have the government got the space to turn things around in the next year, 18 months? I'm not entirely sure they have. And even if they have, actually in some ways, changing perceptions is even more difficult. I mean, you look at 1997, actually the economy had been growing for 18 months, 2 years. It was the start of the longest period of Britain's economic growth the country had ever seen. But because of Black Wednesday and because of the difficulties the Conservative Party found themselves in, public opinion was just not in that place. And I suspect, at the moment, looking at where we're at, that's where the Conservative Party are. Does scandal help? Of course it doesn't. I don't think it's going to sway lots and lots of votes, but it feeds into, again, this sense, you talk to MPs at Westminster, this public sense where people feel that this government feels tired, it feels marred in corruption, rightly or wrongly, that is a perception out there, and that will feed into a decision that the public may well make, that it is time to change government, that the party, the Conservative Party, needs some time out of power. However, Number 10 will insist, you know what, they will turn things around, the economy will be growing, and that there is this narrow path to victory that they heard about at the last cabinet meeting, and that they and Rishi Sunak can get there. I'm just suggesting at the moment it looks like a pretty difficult and pretty steep hill to climb.
A narrow path, a steep hill, a spindly, I'm not sure what else we can, what is it, a tightrope? Darren McCaffrey, thank you for joining us live from Downing Street there. One of the challenges that Rishi Sunak will be facing, of course, may well come from in his own party. And what do I mean by that? Well, Boris Johnson is in the United States. If you followed him on Twitter, you might scarce believe he's stopped being Prime Minister. This week, he's been meeting with officials from the Ukrainian ambassador to the Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell. He met with the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, and former Speaker Newt Gingrich, the Republican Study Committee, as well as a host of congresspeople and senators. He's appeared on Fox News and ABC News. He's been making the case for Ukraine throughout this all, speaking with these politicians and think tanks, the Centre of European Policy Analysis and the Atlantic Council, all seeing himself as an envoy for Ukraine. Is this the newly crafted role of a global statesman? Or is this a man with half an eye on Westminster? Downing Street told me yesterday that the Prime Minister welcomes all colleagues making the case for Ukraine. But you can't help thinking if, behind the scenes, they think something quite different about the antics of Boris Johnson. Well, let's talk through some of those antics now, because I'm delighted to be joined by Brendan Clark-Smith, the MP for Bassetlaw. We'll be speaking to him in just a moment. He was one of the big supporters of Boris Johnson throughout those final few months. He was made a minister, indeed, in the time that Boris Johnson was in his final stages as Prime Minister. And Brendan, first of all, what's your view of what the former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, of his new role as this sort of global statesman?
Well, I think it's great, Tom. I mean, if you look at the commitment that we've made to Ukraine, Britain has been very much at the forefront of that, something he feels very passionately about, and of course, as one of the first politicians to visit Ukraine as well. It's really important that we drum up more support internationally for that, and he's a great figure to be able to do that. On top of that, obviously, we've had the Foreign Secretary and Defence Secretary doing some great work as well, and the Prime Minister's reiterated his support, so we've got that talent there, why not use it?
I suppose there is a question in terms of how helpful it is for the Prime Minister, because you do have this sort of competing vision. The Foreign Secretary was in the United States 2 weeks ago saying a similar thing. But of course, Boris Johnson, in the way that he does, is going further. He's saying send jets to Ukraine, which is a position that the Prime Minister of this country has not yet arrived at. Is it your view that we should send jets to Ukraine as well as tanks?
Well, I think we need to support them as much as we can. Obviously, Ukraine isn't a member of NATO as things stand, but we've been leading that effort. We've been helping with training, with equipment and so on. So really we want to see an end to this war. Anything that we can do to help that, I think, is great. Government have been fairly clear on their position with it. And of course, backbench MPs such as myself and others will have their own views on things as well. But for me, certainly the Ukrainian people, the ones I speak to in my constituency, you know, they're desperate to go home to that free nation, and we basically want to get Vladimir Putin and his bullies out.
Now, turning back to domestic politics, of course, Prime Minister's questions yesterday surprised some, with the Prime Minister facing a bit of a sticky wicket. He seemed to perform relatively well against Keir Starmer. Is this a new sort of rejuvenated Prime Minister, now 100 days in office?
I think in fairness to the Prime Minister, I mean, he's a very capable performer at PMQs, and I think he's been pretty consistent with that as well. I'm not sure Keir Starmer really knows how to handle him. I think with all the difficulties with strikes and so on, I think that's something that's a pretty sticky wicket for Labour at the moment. Of course, the widespread disruption, we've put things like minimum service levels through, so we're very much on the side of working people with that. And I think in terms of Prime Minister's questions, really, Keir Starmer hasn't been able to land a blow. And of course, all people were talking about yesterday, of course, was Kim Johnson's contribution and having to apologise for appalling comments on Israel. So I think it shows that certainly on his own backbenchers, there's enough trouble for Keir Starmer behind him.
Yes, that was incredibly interesting, a chilling moment in the House of Commons, really. I was sitting up in the press gallery just sort of above Kim Johnson as that statement was made. The word fascism being used about the Jewish state just 4 days after Holocaust Memorial Day was incredibly shocking, was chilling. Is the Labour Party still in this position that it was under Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, I fear so, Tom. I mean, this is the problem, of course. I mean, for all the PR and all the efforts to try and eradicate anti-Semitism in the party and this almost anti-Israel hatred that is still there. You know, it wasn't just described as fascist, the government. Of course, it was also likened to an apartheid state. Now, that's not really kind of constructive language that we want to see, especially with tensions at the moment. We really want to be de-escalating that. And if you look at the IHRA's definition of anti-Semitism, those kind of criticisms are right there at the forefront of it, and people using that kind of language. So it's right that the member actually apologised, and obviously they've tried to discipline for it. But, you know, when is the next person going to be doing this? And it's every time we have a debate on this issue, Tom.
Yes, no, it is important to note that she did apologise in a point of order yesterday, although that was following a meeting with the Chief Whip. And, of course, Kim Johnson remains a Labour MP. Well, Brendan Clark-Smith, thank you so much for joining us here on The Briefing this morning. Really appreciate your time, as always. That's it for us on The Briefing this morning. Catch us again at 9:30 tomorrow. But coming up next, it's Bev Turner Today.
This year on GB News, we've got brand new members in the family.
Join us. Across the entire United Kingdom, we cover the issues that matter to you. GB News will always stay honest, balanced and fair. We want to hear whatever is on your mind.
And we don't talk down to you.
The establishment had their chance.
Now we're here to represent you.
Britain's watching.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing! You see, amazing!
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful.
Come and join us on GB News, the People's News Channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
Why not take us home with you by visiting the GB News shop at gbnews.store. You'll find all the official merchandise, a really good present actually for yourself, your friends or your family.
We ship across the UK mainland at no extra cost. GB News, the People's Channel.
Every weekend, it's Mark Dolan Tonight. Bigger and better, starting at 8 p.m. Friday and Saturday.
Can't be too safe. Bring it on. Has there ever been a more innuendo feature?
And Sundays, we're on at 9.
It's ridiculous.
Just get on with it. Maybe you should get a proper job.
Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Very good morning, welcome to Bev Turner Today on GB News. Today, another interest rate rise, the 10th in a row. Good news for savers, bad news for house buyers. What will it mean for you? Liam Halligan will be here. This comes on the same day that the oil giant Shell has recorded its highest profits in history, almost £70 billion, and the company that owns British Gas seeing record share prices. All this whilst 345,000 court warrants are issued to impose prepayment meters in vulnerable people's homes. We have a lot to talk about. And today is Rishi Sunak's 100th day in power. He's had a lot to deal with, but is there cause for optimism for Tory voters with him at the helm? Plus, in the news, discussion with Dr Rene Hoendekamp and former MP Stephen Pound. Everything from a Christian mother taking a primary school to court over gay pride, Ron DeSantis being a hero for his Floridian constituents, and a potential ban on your wood burner. That's all coming up after a look at the latest news with Rhiannon.
Bev, thank you very much. Good morning. It's coming up to 2 minutes past 10, your top stories from the GB newsroom. The Bank of England is expected to raise interest rates for the 10th time in a row later, this time from 3.5 to 4%. The announcement's expected at midday and is part of efforts to control inflation. Some experts predict we could see a final hike next month, with the rate peaking at 4.5%. Economics commentator Laurie Laird explains how the rise could affect us.
Any debt, credit card debt. A lot of us have credit card debt, and everything is keyed off what's called bank rate. It goes all the way through the system, and it tends to be, we do see consumer interest rates on mortgage rates, credit card debt. We tend to see that go up pretty